In this lecture, we will be discussing meta-sociology. So before we get into what today's lecture is about, I'm just going to clarify a few things. So many sociologists are members of the American Sociological Association, the ASA. The ASA has 53 sections that cover a wide variety of sociological sub-areas. So those who are, let's say, sociologists who specialize in religion will be a part of the Sociology of Religion section of the ASA. Those who are interested in theory will be interested in theory. Those that are interested in methodology will be a member of the methodology section, etc., etc. I bring this up only to tell you, since we are going to be focusing on what is referred to as the history of sociology and social thought section in the coming slides, just wanted you to have an understanding as to what type of subject matter we are basing the data off of. Meta-sociology is a simple way of saying a self-referential mode of inquiry to analyze the discipline itself. And in this lecture, we are going to focus on how historical knowledge in sociology is dissipating. This is just one of many forms of meta-sociology, of course. So, the data on ASA sections show that retired members of the American Sociological Association are very interested in the history of sociology. Emeritus members, retired members, tend to have the history of sociology and social thought section as one of their most popular sections. Student members, typically graduate students, though some undergrads as well, I believe, are not at all interested in the history of sociology. The history of sociology and social thought section is one of the least popular section memberships for student members. So this drastic difference between retired members and student members, the disparity between them is no greater among all 53 sections than for the history of sociology section, with retired members being very interested in the history of the field, whereas student members are very ignorant and very uninterested in the history of the field. So there is a distinction between historical sociology and the history of sociology. Both represent sections in the American Sociological Association. Historical sociology is to perform a sociological analysis within the context of a society in the past. So you might analyze whether or not a society in the past became more or less religious within a certain time frame. Let's say if your time frame was 1800s United States. If you were interested in data of that period and looking at whether or not the United States was becoming more or less religious in the 1800s, you can say that that is a project that falls under the category of historical sociology, but it is not an analysis that would fall under the category of history of sociology. History of sociology refers to the history of the discipline itself. So the latter, history of sociology, is a type of meta-sociology, whereas historical sociology typically is not. There's this issue with positivists who hurl themselves into data sets without having first developed any sort of substantive knowledge about the topics that they're supposed to be experts in, but also no historical knowledge about the field themselves. Positivists tend to be young. There's this really difficult matter with graduate student sociologists in particular, who sort of don't really do much reading at all and just busy themselves with the data without any sort of effort to develop develop any sort of complicated mind, sociological imagination, or develop any sort of historical knowledge, and it really harms the quality of their sociological analyses. There's the distinction between theory and theorizing, with a lot of those who do not develop much historical knowledge tend to refer to theory, in a way that doesn't really show any effort on their part. They don't engage in theorizing. They just refer to theories that have already been put forth by others. This is a very lazy way of going about sociology, where you essentially copy and paste, and maybe change the words a little bit to avoid allegations of plagiarism, but to simply refer to the ideas of those who are much more involved and conceptually driven and knowledgeable and actually did the theorizing themselves. There is a difference between conceptual engagement and this sort of copy and paste theorizing that's very common among positivist scholars, particularly young positivist scholars today. There's also the difficulty of intellectual circularity. There are two ways to understand intellectual circularity, or at least two ways that that are of interest to the present discussion. First, there's a matter of intellectual circularity at the level of empirical contribution. If you do not know anything about the history of the discipline that you are trying to become a scholar in, then you will not be able to know whether or not your results that you're putting forth are truly original. There is no point to a sociological work if it is not novel to some degree. Every sociological piece of research at least tries to make the case, and maybe some of them, get off scot-free from peer review, but they at least have to make the case that what they are putting forth is novel. And there's a downside when it comes to a field that doesn't know anything about its own history, in that we sort of run around in circles. We push out results unaware that they have been produced before. And of course, it's important to have updated results and whatnot, but you can make the case that there isn't much to that type of practice if the results themselves do not correspond to an elevated conceptual apparatus. If you are just updating results, that is not really much of a contribution at all, now is it? Then there's intellectual circularity at the level of meta-philosophy. When we were discussing positivism with Auguste Comte, this is this idea that sociology can become a hard science is, of course, not a new idea, not a new meta-philosophy. And when one returns to it, let's say as some sociologists have in the 21st century, there's this, historical knowledge could act as a shield against sort of falling into these mistakes that we've already fallen into. Of course, it is the case that sociology is too dependent upon the ever-changing human actions, human interests, various contexts, cultures, and histories to ever become a discipline that can reach the positivist stage. This has been well established over and over again, but those who do not know about the intellectual discourse that preceded them, anything about the history of sociology, will thus fall into those holes. Again, this is thus an intellectual circularity at the level of meta-philosophy, a philosophical roundabout as to how we understand the discipline that we are operating within. Without an understanding of the past, scholars cannot fully understand present-day discourse. They cannot understand the reasons behind the present penchant that they might have for particular theories, particular theorists, particular methods, and particular topics. They might see it as the outcome of an objective trajectory, but in reality, social science is a socially constructed matter that it varies from context to context. This sort of move from theory to positivism is not a objective progression. If it were, then we would find this to be the case in all contexts where sociology is practiced. Instead, what we see is something very different. We see great variety, which does imply, from which we can infer that our current tastes and our current views of sociology are, of course, the product of past intellectual discourse, which, nobody would disagree, is contained with fads and foibles, as today's current academic moment is seeped in fads and foibles as well. An understanding of our own history also allows us to think critically about potential assumptions within the field, maybe assumptions we have about sociological work that are not well-founded. Maybe rather than have a passive acceptance toward these matters, we could understand how they have come about and through the traces in which they have emerged from past intellectual battles, and rather than passively accept them simply because they are very common. That's the intellectually lazy way about going about developing a meta-sociological view. One can think critically about these assumptions and try to improve them, even if what you are saying is not particularly fashionable at that given moment in that particular society. If interpreting texts of the past are interpreted in terms of the present, this is also this is a type of outlook that we would call the presentist outlook, to assume that past authors were responding to, that we could criticize them as if they are responding to the same context that we're responding to, or that we can criticize these past texts as if they are developing from an identical canon to the canon that we are emerging from, though with many this is there's more of a neglect of canon or mere appearance of emerging from a canon than an actual involvement with one. There's also this unidirectional assumption of the presentist view, to believe as if we, being within the present moment, are sitting above the texts of the past and could critically analyze it without or as if that we could also learn about that academic moment and just that it's just that unidirectional relationship between reader and text. But in fact, the past text, a text from, let's say, long ago that does not have some of the present internalizations, the present assumptions that our field have, that past text kind of develops an autonomy of itself and is able to teach us about ourselves and teach us about the ways in which our current academic moment is distinct. So driving much of this ahistorical orientation rests in the matter of instrumental rationality, not to be confused with deliberative rationality. Instrumental rationality tends to be associated with careerist pressures, strategic pressures, that is, what type of scholarship should I do or should I not do in order to get a job or get published in certain journals. Whereas deliberative rationality is less concerned about careerism and less concerned about strategy, but rather derives from an intellectual consideration for what is best for scholarly discourse. Those who are consumed by instrumental rationality, the majority of young scholars, I would say, are not concerned about developing intellectually rigorous considerations for what is best for scholarly discourse. In fact, they are not concerned with producing intellectual considerations whatsoever. They are only concerned with a type of rationality that is bound to strategy. There exists no argument that justifies, on intellectual grounds, the neglect of the history of sociology. The only way in which you could possibly justify the neglect for the history of one's field that you are supposed to be an expert in is on merely strategic grounds, which are disconnected from intellectual grounds. The neglect of history of sociology stems from an instrumental rationality, not a deliberative rationality. Also contributing toward this this lack of interest or lack of interest in knowledge in the history of the field stems from the fact that graduate programs do not often offer coursework in the history of sociology. Graduate programs want to shape their fields of study in light of instrumental rationality. They want to have, graduate students within their programs to make their programs seem more prestigious. They want those graduate students to get published a lot and get jobs in high places. History of sociology coursework is an impediment to those goals, or at least is perceived as one. It doesn't show any utility toward instrumental rationality, at least not upon an immediate glance. Sociological research also shows a presentist lens in terms of citations. If you read the reading by Herb Gans today, you will see that sociologists have a tendency to have the vast majority of their citations be from the past decade or two, with a complete neglect of the history of the field, thereby being arguably guilty of accidental plagiarism through historical ignorance. This lack of interest in the history of sociology diminishes sophistication in the field, which is part of the reason that sociology is often seen as a discipline that is either too ideological, too boring, or too easy. There's not a great deal of intellectual rigor if one is never concerned about the complicated texts that our discipline is built upon and simply mindlessly hurling themselves within data sets and pushing out the most self-evident results that do not correspond to any conceptual category, though it is more prudent in terms of seeking, let's say, grants or to represent oneself as a hard science when one's discipline is hardly that. Thus, the complexity of mind, the complexity of our intellectualism is squandered through the employment of this crude form of positivism. Sociologists have a great deal to learn from the humanities. Scholars in departments like history, philosophy, and literature would think would find it inconceivable to ignore their classics. They can students of these fields can very quickly tell you the importance of studying their classics and tell you things about their classics. Younger social scientists, however, know virtually nothing about their classics, and they don't have any curiosity in finding out. Sociology is in a bit of a predicament on the intellectual spectrum, meaning that on the one end of this intellectual spectrum, you could say it rests the humanities, and on the other hand, you could say rests the hard sciences. History, philosophy, and literature are pretty firmly within the humanities side of the intellectual spectrum, and then things like mathematics, physics, chemistry are very firmly within the hard sciences end of the intellectual spectrum. Sociology finds itself in a bit of a predicament because it is caught between these two ends of the spectrum, where they are expected to perform both the humanities type of role and scientific type of role simultaneously. What happens, though, however, is that there is a great deal of pressure through instrumental rationality to perform the scientific side, to pretend that you are a hard science when you are not, and to basically ignore the role of humanities. This, of course, is not an acceptable mode of going about one's scholarly work, as we discussed with Comte, how sociology is the most complex, not meaning the most difficult, but the most complex in the fact that it is a discipline that is entirely dependent upon human action and human interests. It is therefore categorically incorrect to assume that we are in the business of law finding, particularly any sort of universal rationalities that are embedded in human behavior. This has been shown to be a pipe dream for decades. There's so little reading and yet so much writing in this field, and you can maybe even say in U.S. culture and U.S. journalism more broadly. And of course, there's a great deal of problems with this because one who writes but does not read is not worth reading. I mean, you don't want to listen to a person who knows nothing. And sociologists who ignore the classics and ignore the history of their field tend to know nothing. They tend to not have a very complex mind, and they are really unable to assess complicated work. Young social scientists do not read the classics, but rather just refer to them. If they do that, sometimes they don't even do that. They might make a citation to the classics, but this is just to merely appear as if one has put forth some theoretical effort. It is sort of a theory as decoration, as I've written here, rather than actually theorizing, rather than actually rigorously theorizing or putting effort into unpacking the conceptual underpinnings of findings. In the optional reading today, there was a quote about how before one sits down to write, you should really turn to the pages of a classic, and you'll find that it really does help your writing quite a bit. If it makes sense that if you are going to do anything, if you want to become a good cook, you're going to look at what some of the best cooks do and try to be influenced by them. If you're going to be a writer of fiction, you turn to some of the best novels and in the literary canon and try to be influenced by the best possible. And it seems as if in social science there's this notion that one does not need to read at all before they write. And so, of course, before you sit down and write, look at how other people write. Look at how some of the best people write. Best people at their jobs write. And classical texts are by far the most sophisticated and complicated sociological ideas that we have, a sort of a repository of ideas that can nourish us intellectually and really improve our current work that is in dire need of improvement today in contemporary U.S. sociology.